When it comes to manifesting, how does everything happen automatically? Neville stated, everything happens automatically. Hello, this is Robert Meade, and this is a discussion and reading of the chapter 23 of The Power of Awareness, Case Histories. This book was written in 1952, The Power of Awareness, by mystic and teacher Neville Goddard. In this video, I am going to be answering that question for you through the reading and explanation of two amazing stories by Neville in this chapter 23 of The Power of Awareness. I'm also going to be showing you how you can personally apply the same methods starting today. Let's get into it. Chapter 23, Case Histories. It will be extremely helpful at this point to cite a number of specific examples of the successful application of this law. Actual case histories are given. In each of these, the problem is clearly defined, and the way imagination was used to attain the required state of consciousness is fully described. In each of these instances, the author of this book was either personally concerned or was told the facts by the person involved. This is a story with every detail of which I am personally familiar, states Neville. In the spring of 1943, a recently drafted soldier was stationed in a large army camp in Louisiana. He was intensely eager to get out of the army, but only in an entirely honorable way. The only way he could do this was to apply for discharge. The application then required the approval of his commanding officer to become effective. So we see from the very beginning he did the normal procedure that was required. And then let's continue. Based on Army regulations, the decision of the commanding officer was final and could not be appealed. The soldier, following all the necessary procedure, applied for a discharge. Within 4 hours, the application returned marked disapproved. Yes, disapproved. Convinced he could not appeal the decision to any higher authority, militarily or civilian, he turned to his own consciousness, determined to rely on the law of assumption. So this is where you and I begin to receive the answer how things happen automatically by the state of consciousness we are in. So pay close attention to the procedure he followed in applying the law of assumption. The soldier realized that his consciousness was the only reality, that his particular state of consciousness determined the events he would encounter. So notice what he did next. That night, in the interval between getting into bed and falling asleep, he concentrated on consciously using the law of assumption. In imagination, he felt himself to be in his own apartment in New York City. He visualized his apartment, that is, in his mind's eye. He actually saw his own apartment, mentally picturing each one of the familiar rooms with all the furnishings vividly real. With this picture clearly visualized and laying flat on his back, he completely relaxed physically. In this way, he induced a state bordering on sleep, at the same time retaining control of the direction of his attention. When his body was completely immobilized, he assumed that he was in his own room and felt himself to be lying in his own bed. I'm going to leave you a couple of links above for you to actually click on that will take you to Chapter 19, which I've discussed a couple of times in a couple of different videos, how to use what Neville was doing here, which is the alpha state meditation. also known as the state akin to sleep. Now, I'll leave those for you at the end of this video because I want you to stay focused and stay with me all the way through, because there's some powerful points about how everything happened automatically based on what he set up by going into this meditation, lying down and imagining himself elsewhere, bringing his apartment in New York to that very cot he was laying on that Army training base in Louisiana. So let's continue. So he was lying in his own bed in his imagination in New York, a very different feeling than that of lying on an army cot. In imagination, he rose from the bed, walked from room to room, touching various pieces of furniture in that New York apartment. He then went to the window and, with his hands resting on the sill, looked out on the street on which his apartment faced in New York. So vivid was all of this in his imagination that he saw in detail the pavement, the railings, the trees, and the familiar red brick of the building on the opposite side of the street. He then returned to his bed and felt himself drift off to sleep. Personally, friends, having lived in New York City in Brooklyn Heights in Brooklyn for 4 years by the East River, there were a lot of these red brick buildings, classic buildings in New York City. So I can vividly imagine exactly what he's talking about. Next, he helps us appreciate how important that meditation state of imagination is so vital, and why it is so important when he highlights, as he continues, he knew that it was most important in the successful use of this law that at the actual point of falling asleep, his consciousness be filled with the assumption that he was already what he wanted to be. All that he did in imagination was based on the assumption that he was no longer in the army. Night after night, the soldier enacted this drama in his imagination. Night after night, in his imagination, he felt himself honorably discharged, back in his home, seeing all the familiar surroundings, and falling asleep in his own bed. This continued for 8 nights. For 8 nights, his objective experience continued to be directly opposite to his subjective experience. In other words, what he was actually experiencing, he was still in the army, he was still at that training base. He wasn't where he had imagined yet, and yet he persisted. As he continues, for 8 days, his objective experience continued to be directly opposite to his subjective experience in consciousness each night before going to sleep. On the 9th day, orders came through from the battalion headquarters for the soldier to fill out a new application for discharge. Let's notice the amazing events that then took place. Shortly after this was done, he was ordered to report to the colonel's office. During the discussion, the colonel asked him if he was still desirous of getting out of the army. Upon receiving an affirmative reply, the colonel said that personally he disagreed. And while he had strong objections to approving of the discharge, he had decided to overlook these objections and to approve it. Within a few hours, the application was approved, and the soldier, now civilian, was on a train bound for home. So, friends, there's a lot more to this story. If you look into it in Neville's other lectures, he points out that he was 39, just getting ready to turn 40, which is the limit for drafting age. When all of this occurred, he already had a wife and a life with children in New York. And so it wasn't so much about being against being a soldier as it was he wanted to return to his normal life. An interesting aside point is that although he places this story in the third person, This is actually about him himself. This is his own personal experience that he's giving when he's talking about this soldier. And so absolutely an amazing demonstration of manifesting. And you notice how things just happened. They just unfolded for him because he did what was needed, and that is sounding down in consciousness, subconsciously deep, that he was no longer in the army. By the power of imagination and the law of assumption, he was able to effectively accomplish that particular goal at that point in his life, as he did many goals using the law over the course of his amazing life. So through the power of his imagination, everything happened automatically. The colonel thought of his own choice that he would discharge Neville, even though it was contrary to his own personal opinion. It was the power that the colonel had nothing to do with. It was actually an influence because of Neville first becoming conscious that he was no longer in the army and he was actually home in New York. And we can apply the same method. Stay tuned. The second story I'm going to share today is equally, if not even more powerful. This is a striking story of an extremely successful businessman demonstrating the power of imagination and the law of assumption. Neville states, "I know this family intimately, and all the details were told me by the son described herein." The story begins when he was 20 years old. He was next to the oldest in a large family of 9 brothers and 1 sister. The father was one of the partners in a small merchandising business. In his 18th year, the brother referred to in this story left the country in which they lived and traveled 2,000 miles to enter college and complete his education. Shortly after his first year in college, he was called home because of a tragic event in connection with his father's business. Through the machinations of his associate, his father was not only forced out of business, but was the object of false accusations, impinging on his character and integrity. At the same time, he was deprived of his rightful share in equity of the business. The result was he found himself largely discredited and almost penniless. It was under these circumstances that the son was called home from college. He returned, his heart filled with one great resolution. He was determined he would become outstandingly successful in business. So now we have the foundation for what developed. The son had to be called back from college to help his family out. But when he came back, he was focused on the fact that he was going to become a very, very successful businessman. So this tells us, when you have a goal, how bad do you want it? He wanted it badly and was determined that he and his family would be successful in spite of the circumstances. Now you're going to find out in this story how things automatically happened for him to manifest his dream. Neville continues, "The first thing he and his father did was to use the little money they had to start their own business. They rented a small store on a side street, not far from the large business of which the father had been one of the principal owners. There they started a business bent upon real service to the community." What I really appreciate about this story is that you're going to find that there were actions taken. Now, there's actions that were taken consciously and subconsciously to manifest, and we'll get to that in a moment. But in the meantime, are you noticing that The son and the father didn't just sit on their hands. They got to work. They got focused on starting another business, starting from scratch with the little bit of money they had with a small store that was bent on giving real service to the community. Likewise with us. We don't just sit and pray and hope. If you want to qualify for a new job, wouldn't you automatically study that subject? If you wanted to lose weight and become fit, wouldn't it be the natural thing for you to begin to eat better, take better care of yourself physically, and perhaps start a exercise program? My point is that in a previous video, when I said that Neville said to do absolutely nothing, this is not in conflict with that. It's a great misunderstanding, this idea of do nothing. It doesn't mean you don't pursue your craft, that you don't get better at what you want to be and do, that you don't spend time thinking about how you can become and be the type of person and live the life that you want to have. Of course you do, but that's a natural thing when you are intensely focused on a goal and isn't a side point from the actual manifestation process, which we will get into. It was shortly thereafter that the son, with instinctive awareness that it was bound to work, deliberately used imagination to attain an almost fantastic objective. Every day on the way to and from work, he passed the building of his father's former business, the biggest business of its kind in the country. It was one of the largest buildings with the most prominent location in the heart of the city. On the outside of the building, there was a huge sign on which the name of the firm was painted in large, bold letters. Day after day, as he passed by, a great dream took shape in the son's mind. He thought of how wonderful it would be if it was his family that had this great building, his family that owned and operated this great business. One day he stood gazing at the building. In his imagination, he saw a completely different name on the huge sign across the entrance. Now the large letters spelled out his family name. In these histories, actual names are not used. For the sake of clarity in this story, we will use hypothetical names and assume that the son's family name was Lollard. Where the sign read F.N. Moth and Company, in imagination, he actually saw the name, letter by letter, in Lollard and Sons. He remained looking at the sign with his eyes wide open, imagining that it read, in Lollard and Sons, twice a day, week after week, month after month, for 2 years. He saw his family's name over the front of the building. He was convinced that if he felt strongly enough that the thing was true, it was bound to be the case. And by seeing in imagination his family name on the sign, which implied that they owned the business, and he became convinced that one day they would own it too. Now, let's take a time out here. Can you feel his intensity? Can you feel his focus? He self-convinced himself on a conscious and subconscious level by day after day, week after week, and month after month for 2 years. This is also a demonstration of persistency and focus and a realization that some goals, even with the assistance from God, you could say, still take time on occasion. In this case, they built up their reputation as hardworking, having their own business that was out for real service to the community. And in the meanwhile, every time he walked by the building, he saw their name on the building because he envisioned that they owned it. So there's real focus and persistence here, a great lesson for us. Before continuing, do you ever have people that are friends or family that actually, although they appear to be lovingly concerned about you, don't have your faith, they don't have your goal and your focus, and may say something to discourage what you're going after? This is exactly what happened from this son's own family member. Notice how this goes. During this period, he told only one person what he was doing. He confided in his mother, who with loving concern tried to discourage him in order to protect him from what might be a great disappointment. In your life, have you had people either in your childhood or as you grew up, or even co-workers and others around you, that if you share your goal with them, sometimes they appear to be lovingly concerned because they don't want you to expect too much. They don't want you to shoot so high because it's unfamiliar to them, and they come across as if they want to protect you and they're concerned about you, which may be true. However, how do you respond in those situations now as an adult when you set your goals? Notice the son's response to that supposed loving concern. Despite this, he persisted day after day. He stayed focused. Now, we can do the exact same thing. You have to keep your mind totally on what you want and believe it in day after day and be persistent. Sometimes it comes quickly. Sometimes it takes a minute, week, a month, a year, or longer. But persistency is paramount. As I asked earlier, how much do you want to accomplish your goal? There needs to be a focus and an intensity and a true desire to become and have and do what you want to be in your life. Now, if you don't have that type of self-control, that's why we are wise on occasion to actually have somebody we're accountable to, such as a life coach. In my case, I'm a life coach, imagination coach, and I keep my clients accountable for their goals. I keep them on track. And so if you need someone outside your circle, consider a coach. Of course, I would love to help you, but in any case, having a mentor or someone that supports you regardless, perhaps outside of your intimate circle, is often of a great benefit. Let's get back to our story, and you're going to notice how things automatically happened, almost all of which was really outside that family's power. Things developed, circumstances, and the opportunity, and the realization. Let's see how it happened. 2 years later, the large company failed, and the coveted building was up for sale. On the day of the sale, he, the son, seemed no nearer ownership than he had been 2 years before when he began to apply the law of assumption. During this period, they had worked hard, and their customers had implicit confidence in them. However, they had not earned anything like the amount of money required for the purchase of the property. Nor did they have any source from which they could borrow the necessary capital. Now notice this. Making even more remote their chances of getting it was the fact that this was regarded as the most desirable property in the city, and a number of wealthy business people were prepared to buy it. On the actual day of the sale, to their complete surprise, a man, almost a total stranger, came into their shop and offered to buy the property for them. Due to some unusual conditions involved in this transaction, the son's family could not even make a bid for the property. They thought the man was joking. However, this was not the case. The man explained that he had watched them for some time, admired their ability, believed in their integrity, and that supplying the capital for them to go into business on a large scale was an extremely sound investment for him. That very day, the property was theirs. What the son had persisted in seeing in his imagination was now a reality. The hunch of the stranger was more than justified. Today, this family owns not only the particular business referred to, but owns many of the largest industries in the country in which they live. Again, let's pause here. This is not the Lollard family. This is actually Neville Goddard's family. So that was his brother Victor that used his imagination and persistence to imagine his family owning that building, their name on the side of the building, and them actually owning and running the business from that building, being vastly successful. It was actually the Goddard family. Now, if you actually look it up online, the Goddard family in Barbados, you will see that they still have a vast business in Barbados. What an amazing and true story. Continuing, Neville says, the son, seeing his family name over the entrance of that great building, long before it was actually there, was using exactly the technique that produces results by assuming the feeling that he already had what he desired, by making this vivid reality in his imagination, by determined persistence, regardless of appearances and circumstance. He inevitably caused his dream to become reality. Yes, things automatically happened. I hope you found tremendous value in this. Please click the videos above to get more on how you can apply both of those techniques so that you can experience these things unfolding automatically for you as you apply the law of assumption in your lives.
Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars. Let me see what spring